data analytics, and has played in the Oracle and Workiva space for many years. And we're going to have a kind of a wide ranging talk about not only his professional background and what he does now, but how you might be able to use some of the strategies that he advocates going forward. So, Daniel, first of all, with an incredibly long winded introduction, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Daniel, could you tell us your professional background?
Sure. So I've been in technology for over 15 years now. I started doing technology support for my college back when I was working there. I did technology support for a large consulting company. Then I went into systems projects right after I graduated. Worked for a small boutique consulting firm, went on to a big four consulting firm, and then started my own business because I wanted to innovate past what I would be allowed to do working for somebody else.
So, the types of work you do now, could you generally describe the services Villani Analytics provides?
Sure. So we do a lot of financial systems and data integration projects for customers. We work with mainly medium to large businesses that are looking to put in like FP&A software or do any types of data integrations between one system and another. We do that in a couple of different ways. One, we get, and business results, based on what requirements they outline. And we also make sure that we're implementing them with all the latest practices and, and data controls that are required in place.
Do you also help customers after implementation in utilizing these systems or creating bespoke systems for them to better utilize data analytics?
We do. So we help at all aspects. So if you're interested in implementing some technology, but you're just not sure what the best one is, we'll help with vendor selection processes, taking your requirements, outlining them, and matching them up against what the different vendors do best. Once we implement any system, we do offer support after the implementation. We'll do that in a couple of different ways. If you just need some extra, a bucket of hours for if you have questions, we'll do that. If you want an ongoing managed service where we'll run your system for you and be there for any questions, we do that as well.
Daniel, many of the listeners to this podcast are in the compliance or dare I even say legal space. So
Mm-hmm.
could we start with some basic definitions? For instance, what is ERP and what is EPM?
Yeah, great question. So ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, and you could think of this at the very basic as your fundamental accounting system. So where you're inputting all of your transactions, you send an invoice to a customer. Where does that get logged? That's more often than not going in an ERP system. That's the very simplified version of it. They offer a lot more than just that, but that's the easiest to understand. With EPM, that's Enterprise Performance Management. So say you're doing a budget or a forecast, for example, you're typically doing that in an EPM type of system to, so that way it's at a little bit higher level. It's not at a very detailed level so that you can do your medium to long range planning.
So, Daniel, in terms of vendor selection and your help with companies in that area, that is generally viewed as one of the most critical components around can you trust your vendor? What's their data privacy, their data protection? Do you help really in all aspects of that?
I do. So it can range from anything like, will this vendor, meet my requirements, or what type of security practices that they have in place. And I'll say this is one of the most important aspects is choosing the right vendor before you start, and choosing the right consultant or resource to help you select that vendor. Just because there are a lot of companies out there that are only aligned to one or a couple of different vendors. So, they may lead you in a spot based on, what's in it for them in terms of when you need it implemented. I take the full unbiased approach where I'm happy to recommend a system that I don't implement just because I don't do it for the money that comes out of it. I do it to make sure that you get the right solution for your business.
Daniel, when a company contacts you or your company, or you make a call, who typically are the people you're talking to? Is it a CISO? Is it a head of IT? Is it a chief technology officer? Or perhaps someone else?
Yeah. So what's a little bit interesting about the financial technology space is that in some cases the business owns the technology, and it'll be someone in finance or financial planning and analysis or FP&A. Other times they have IT own the end solution. So I'll be talking to maybe not like a CIO. It's usually like a level or two down from there. And other times, businesses will have a specialized group set up, which will be like a financial systems group where they own the underlying technology, and I'll be working with them.
I'd like to focus on the example you gave where the business owns the tech.
Hmm.
So, whether that's a CFO or other financial officer, do you have the opportunity to work with the CFO's team to really create a product for them, or is it working with the more of the tech group of the company to implement the solution?
Usually, I'm working directly with the business, and the reason why is at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones ultimately using the system. It might be supported by IT, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't meet the needs of the business, they're not going to use it. And the use cases range from, you're doing financial planning or forecasting or reporting, but also it could be on implementing your data controls. And at the end of the day, the CFO is the one that's signing off and risking jail time if the numbers aren't right. So it's very important to make sure that your numbers are right and that you have the right proof in place, other than just John Doe told me that he put the numbers in right, when he was working at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I'm sure they're okay. A lot of, I laugh because it sounds completely, imaginative, but you'd be surprised at how many organizations and some of the leading organizations and Fortune 500 ones that are relying on, somebody's word that their numbers are okay.
You list a range of services on your website that you and your company engage in. I wanted to maybe go through some of these with some specificity, and I'd like to
Sure.
start with data verification. What is data verification? Is that sort of data cleansing? Is that data integrity? Something else, or maybe all of the above?
Yeah, great question. So it really is all of the above with a focus on making sure at the end of the day that the numbers that you're reporting on are correct. Because if they're not, then then your finance group is in a lot of trouble.
So, what about in the scope of data governance? And I ask
Mhm.
that because I see data governance as directly in the ESG discussion, particularly around the G. And it can
Mhm.
be what you've just described in terms of accurate data, but actually, I see that all the way up to the very top with the big G. Do
Mhm.
you have those kinds of discussions with your clients as well?
Yeah, I do. And governance, can be a very broad or very narrow topic depending on who you're talking to in the organization. But it's not just important to have governance in place. It's also equally important to make sure that you have the documentation around your governance in place. So one of the organizations that I helped, this was back in 2015. It was a large bank. I'm not going to give you the name of them, but it made the New York Times, and you could research it yourself if you're that interested in it. They ran into an audit issue, and they were hit with a significant deficiency, which meant that unless they cleared it, they couldn't issue a dividend to their shareholders. Which, as you know, anyone that's a stockholder of that company, if they no longer get a dividend, that stock price is gonna plummet. So they were given, I think, 6 to 8 months to remediate this. And the issue wasn't that their numbers were wrong. The issue was that they didn't have, adequate documentation to show at every step of the chain when their data comes from where it originates to, the ultimate reports that they put out. They couldn't prove that, they have the controls at every step and that there's documentation around how the data gets from one step to another. You could go to people within the organization and they can tell you exactly how it happens, and we knew that it was happening the way that it should, but because they didn't have it written down and documented, that caused a big issue. So it's not just a matter of ensuring that the data is right, it's also being able to have that documentation that shows that it's being checked at every step of the chain, and the right people are looking at it and performing the right mix of controls on there.
So I'm going to take what you just said and rephrase it in compliance speak.
Mm-hmm.
Because I say the three most important things on any compliance program, it doesn't matter whether it's corruption, money laundering, data security, data privacy, is the following: document, document, document. Because as you just said, if it's not documented in a regulator's eyes, it never happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I come from the anti-corruption compliance world, and there are actually enforcement actions where it appeared the company did the right thing. They didn't have any backup documentation. So that's a real problem. So I was really gratified that you had that example and could talk about it even at a major institution. Are you still having those kinds of conversations with clients today about the documentation and the auditability, if that's a word, of whatever process they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big thing that happens, and everybody thinks like, oh, you gave an example of a top 10 global bank. My little mid-market bank isn't, doesn't have that problem, or that's not an issue with us. And this is something that happens regardless of whether you're, the little company or the big company. And a lot of people think that, hey, I'm not the big company, I'm the mid-sized company or the small company. If I were big, I would have the budget to solve all these problems. But then, when you get to these big companies, you see that this is still a challenge that they all face. So it really does affect everyone. And you can't stress the importance of it, just because if one person knows what your process is, well, now you have that key man risk of, well, what happens if that person leaves the company tomorrow, or God forbid something happens to that person, and now you don't have that person in your company anymore. What do you do?
In the energy world, we call that run over by the bus syndrome.
Yeah. I
So,
don't want to say that, because I actually was at a client where they had to completely replace the system because there was one person who knew how it worked, and that person actually was run over by a bus. He was, a bicyclist in Manhattan, and as anyone that lives anywhere near there, has been there, can see. It's not a very safe place to be cycling. So that happened, and they had to replace an entire system because nobody could tell you how it worked, and it would be too expensive for somebody to deconstruct every layer of it. It was cheaper to just build something from scratch.
well, I used to be a cyclist as well, but I got run over by a Hummer. So
Um,
uh, I feel like I can say that. Um, that let me turn to you. Really, this is really an intriguing way this conversation has gone, because you said you help companies in vendor selection. Obviously, in reviewing potential vendors, their documentation is critical. I was wondering if you might talk about the reason you would document, the reason you have an auditable trail, not from the regulatory perspective, but just the B2B perspective to do business. And once again, I want to draw on my experience from the energy space, is they
mhm.
will audit companies' compliance programs just to see if they can become an approved vendor. Do you have those kinds of discussions as well?
I don't have any, a lot of those types of discussions, but I always do stress that every time that you're doing anything, and it could just be a basic vendor selection, to have everything written down and documented, because you never know when things come back to bite you, especially like when you go to choose a software vendor, for example, for a system that you have. You're going to come up with a list of requirements. You're going to give it to the vendor, and 9 times out of 10, when you ask them, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? The answer is always yes, right? Because if you have enough money and you have people with the right brains and all that, you can go and build that. But sometimes them saying yes, we can do it, it's something like, well, if you built a custom program that leveraged our APIs, that did this and did that, right? And for the average business, like, you don't have developers on staff, you don't have a way to go build and maintain that. So for me, it's always important to go in and to say, I don't ask, can you do this? I might ask, can you do this? But then there's a follow-up question asked of, how would you do it in your in your platform. Because if they start telling you, yes, you can do it, and the way that you do this is invoke our API and do this and XYZ and get a custom developer to do that, and you go to vendor two and they're like, yeah, you just click these 5 buttons and do it. At the end of the day, the system needs to be maintainable by whoever you turn this over. It's great if someone hires me to say, run and maintain this forever. I'd happily take your money and do it. But I don't want you to be working with me because you have to. I want you to be working with me because we did such a great job on the implementation that you just want me to be around forever, not you need me to be around forever.
I'd all like to turn to some issues around data analytics and ask, have you helped clients after you put the system in place to really then utilize the system to analyze data in ways that typically a human can't just looking at them? So once again, in my world, it's siloed data that you have to break through the silos, and you have a data lake, and you may look for patterns in raked leaves. You may look for anomalies. How do you help a client think through the use of data after you've helped them set up a system, or if they already have one in place?
Yeah, I think one of the most important aspects, when you is, a lot of companies think that just because they have a lot of data, that makes them better than their competitors or better positioned than their competitors. And yes, having the data is better than not having it, right? But it's also about how you're using that data. And sometimes it's hard to see, and envision looking forward, how am I going to use this? But once you start putting systems in place and you start consuming some of the data, you start to see that like light bulb moment in the client's eyes over there, and on their faces of, oh wait, if I can measure this, why can't I measure that? So sometimes it's like inspiration that comes from the customer once they start seeing what we're building in the current system. Sometimes it's a matter of, as I'm going and building a system and I start to see, oh, you have this data in here. Have you thought about using, this data for, this other purpose? So I know we talked, or, you mentioned ESG a little bit before. And, in ESG reporting, a lot of the data that you're pulling in is the same data that you're using if you did a financial planning implementation where you're looking at, managing your compensation for your employees. Well, a lot of that comp data would also go into an ESG report of, pay disparity and all that. So sometimes the data you're already collecting can be used, for many more reasons than what you know.
That is a great insight, because I try to tell people the reason I'm so passionate about ESG is I see it as a business process.
Hmm.
And it's a business process that has visibility, sometimes at the board level, sometimes at senior executive level, sometimes as the head of ESG or sustainability. But you have someone looking at systems in an integrated way that they've never done before. And to me, that's the power of ESG. It's not moving a woke discussion forward. It's that it's an enhanced business process, and that's exactly what I heard you describe, or should I say, is that a fair assessment of what I heard you describe?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I laugh a little bit when you say that. About the woke crowd over there, because it's kind of how things started, where companies were just like, you know what, I'll buy a solar panel and I'll throw it on the roof of my building, and now I can say that I'm going towards carbon neutrality over here. But it's really evolved to be a lot more than just that. And there are a lot of cases where right now there is a bill that was signed a couple months back, at least here in the U.S., where companies get over $300 billion of tax credits just by implementing many of the things that an ESG program would want them to implement, trying to be carbon neutral. And it's something where, if you're looking to put in a system and you're afraid that, oh, it costs a lot of money to go and implement an ESG reporting system. Well, if you look at the tax credits that you could possibly get from being able to show your ESG program, it could pay for itself or even be profitable for you to undertake that kind of a program.
One of the banes in the compliance world is the siloed nature of data. Is that as true in the financial reporting world, or is it something different you see from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, data is very siloed, and it's funny because as we push to the cloud, we're seeing a shift in terms of, there used to be, when all these systems were on premise in an organizations, on their servers, they'd push that data to a centralized, data warehouse, data lake, wherever they're pushing it to. And now that you start to see the emergence of the cloud, these companies are going more to the the best in class, best of breed for each type of system. So they might have a CRM system for their customer relationship data, and that might be Salesforce, and for their planning they might have Oracle. They might have a product like Workiva on top of that to do ESG and some of their financial documents. And what happens is that a lot of this data, you start to see that the Oracle Cloud data is stuck in Oracle Cloud, and the Salesforce data is stuck in Salesforce, and your Workday data for your HR data is stuck in Workday, and so it's becoming even more important as we start to pick different vendors for different things, to look at and say, hey, look, data is more siloed than ever. And the companies that are going to bring it together in the most meaningful way are the ones that are going to better compete in their industry.
Well, Daniel, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or your company, or any of the topics we've touched on. What would be the best place or places for them to go?
Sure, you can check out our YouTube channel, Villani Analytics. We post a lot of content on a lot of different areas of technology. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. I post content every day about the problems that organizations face and how to solve them.
And I'm going to give a shout out to his LinkedIn. I haven't checked out the YouTube, but he's got a lot of great stuff on LinkedIn, a lot of applicability in a wide variety of areas. Daniel, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
All right, thank you so much.